Okay, it is the top of the hour, and I've hit the record button. I'm Dr. Deanna Minich, and I wanted to welcome all of you here to this webinar in which I'm going to be talking about some of my favorite topics that include science and the art of color for healing. So this is going to be a very interesting presentation, I must admit, because I'm going to tour you through a very colorful landscape. So rather than give you study after study after study, which I'm used to doing, hopefully I will fill your afternoon or your webinar recording time with lots of visuals, which I believe really do help us with our sense of creativity, our sense of thinking, and actually retaining things better. So thanks for being here with me for this ride together. So what I'm going to do is to take you through some of my thought process. And so I'm not going to answer any specific questions about diagnosis or treatment. And what I'm really aiming for here is to talk with you as a health professional. So this webinar is intended to be within that scope, within that segment. And so if you're a health practitioner, whether you do naturopathic medicine, you're a medical doctor of some type, a chiropractic physician, you're a nutritionist, a health coach, a yoga practitioner, an energy medicine practitioner, I will be speaking with you as it relates to your clinical practice. And that's really what this webinar is meant to do, is to give you an insight into the framework that I use within my own clinical practice and what I teach. In fact, what I do teach is a certified food and spirit practitioner program. It's a certification that is 12 weeks long. And so it is an online training. And so you can be anywhere in the world and do this, which is very convenient. And then following the training, this is a new part that I've added, we have an 8-week practicum where you can put into motion everything that you've just learned. So part of the reason for doing this webinar during this time is because we are currently taking registrants. We've already been taking in applications. There is a whole process for how that happens. And so if you look at the website, which is foodandspirit.com, you'll see a listing of what is required in order to find out more and even to apply for the program. So we are going to start it at the end of September, on September 24th, and end the training part on December 16th. And then we start up again for the practicum in January of 2019, and we go until March 17th. So it's a rather extensive program, but I do think that the people that have gone through it have found it to be incredibly, I would say, even life-changing, changing in their professional lives. And what I really like to encourage people to do is to have a different way of thinking about their practice, or even thinking about their own lives. And then that changes what we do within our professional life. So that's available to you. And again, foodandspirit.com is the website to go to. Super, let's dive into the content. This is, again, I always get a thrill when I get to speak about these concepts, which may seem to the outsider to be like connecting the dots. Like they don't all neatly go into a bucket unless you start to see the larger expanse about of how everything interconnects. So one of the things that I noticed even within my own practice and my own professional journey is that being a PhD nutritionist and working just on nutrition after a while became very limiting. And I realized that how we eat is telling us something about how we live, and how we live is telling us something about how we eat. So it's a microcosm of the macrocosm and vice versa. And so at a certain point, it was during my own professional and personal journey, as well as what I was seeing for other people, I was thinking, well, how do we have healing of the whole self? How do we actually make that happen? And so when I was focused on nutrition, which is a very physical science, I realized that what I'm focusing on is the body. But then there's another form of nourishment that I was uncovering and discovering working with clients. And that was this sense of nourishment. So if we take nutrition into more of a life sense, that becomes this idea of nourishment. And so how do we bridge those two together? How do we see nourishment as the 21st century healing? How do we bring together how we're eating and how we're living into one consolidated whole? And of course, all of you listening in, perhaps you're listening even for your own health, there are many doorways into that landscape of healing. So you could say, well, I don't do food or nutrition, but I do focus on people's sense of meaning and purpose because I'm a life coach. Or I focus on more of the therapy side and work with people on their emotional expression. Or I'm a personal trainer and I focus on movement. Each of these portals is all very relevant. So one, in my mind, is not better than the other. It's a matter of finding that doorway in order to create a ripple through effect. And so through this whole landscape of what I call food and spirit, we embrace the whole. We embrace the spectrum. And what I also believe and have known to be true just through experience is that by working on any one of these, we come to a place where there is great change and that can ripple through somebody's entire life. So for some of you who don't know me as well, yes, as I mentioned, I have a PhD. I have a master's degree in nutritional biochemistry. I've done some clinical training as well with the Institute for Functional Medicine. I teach for the Institute for Functional Medicine. I teach for the University of Western States. So I do lots of teaching, lots of speaking. One of the sides that people don't know about me is that I'm also very active in the creative arts, and that's nothing I've studied for. That is something that came through my own healing journey and my process, in which I found that simply working on just the physical aspects, whether it was of nutrition or dietary supplements or physical activity or going for a massage, that these things were all well and good. However, they only got me so far. And I felt as though I needed something more. Something wasn't being fully realized. And so one of the things that came to me was this sense of color. There was a certain point in my life when I wasn't actually feeling very colorful. I was feeling very depressed, very anxious. I had a lot of stress. This was during the time that I was in graduate school. And it was almost like in that time of desperation, what happened for me was I began to be forced into this different way of seeing. It's almost like I needed that. I was at the bottom and I needed a way to look up and see something a little bit more illuminating. So I started to tap into color. I just started painting. I started painting shapes. I was really drawn to vivid colors, and those colors seemed to really feed me. Of course, they didn't feed me at the level of physical matter. They were feeding me more at the level of my emotions, my mind, my overall being, and my quality of life. So after that moment, and after having some resolution of my depression, my anxiety, as well as some physical issues that I was having, what I decided to do was that I needed to have this sense of creativity, this sense of color in everything that I did. And so after that time, I was in this process of birthing food and spirit, which essentially is this combination of color and creativity in with science. And one of the things I recognize is that when I was on the science side, the pure science side, what I was missing is the sense of mystery, the sense of artistry. And then when I was on the sense of art, I felt like, well, there's a piece of science, there's a piece of medicine, there's a piece of healing that I'd love to bring into this. And so oftentimes you'll see me use this metaphor of the rainbow. The rainbow to me is what's connecting the spirit, the sense of beingness, the things that we can't necessarily see, with the things that are physical, the things that we can see. So the rainbow to me is a wonderful image, a wonderful metaphor of how we bridge together science and art. So the right brain and the left brain being very logical, needing to know the studies, give me the evidence, show me the proof, whereas the right brain is more about the poetry in addition to the practicality. It's more about how we can change brain synapses through music, through sound, as much as we can through an image. And so, again, even my nutritional practice has changed dramatically as I've shifted away from a lot of the analysis paralysis that can happen and into this sense of creativity, color, and variety. So, the question that I'm thinking about for all of you as health practitioners is, so you might like the sound of all of this, and you might be wondering, well, how do I bring in more of this? How do I bring in more of the art and the science? Well, I think it's already happening for us in the science. I keep apprised of much of the literature, and what I'm noticing is some very interesting terms and trends happening in the 21st century. So, for example, one of the things that I've seen emerging in the literature is this concept of symbolic disease. What is symbolic disease? Symbolism is one of the most powerful aspects of healing, when people can tell their story, when we connect to myth, to metaphor. And what symbolic disease is really getting at is this whole idea of seeing our body as a story. And so if you read this article, there are a number of case studies in which a specific clinical condition was being looked at through the eyes of more of the story aspect. Like, what does this actually symbolize? If we have inflammation in the body, does that tell us something about being emotionally inflamed? So if we look a bit deeper into the layers, hence the concentric circles that you see in this slide, this image, that maybe we start from the center point of having a physical symptom, but then there's this ripple through effect that can go much wider, broader into more of the mental, emotional sphere. So symbolic disease, that has been appearing. Another term that I think is really interesting is Ayer nutrigenomics. This whole interface of how ancient traditions like Ayurveda, like traditional Chinese medicine, are now being mapped into very cutting edge modern language that have to deal with genomics. So what I think is happening, and this is the right time for it to be happening in the age of personalization, is a convergence of the ancient, the modern, the poetry aspects with the practical aspects. It's almost like, how do you take the practical and make it real, but through that interface of perhaps spirituality? So one of the things that I studied on my journey, and that has helped me, especially when I was in my early 20s, was the chakra system. And this is something that we see in the ancient traditions, where we have certain energy focal points in the body, and these all have certain symbolic themes. And one of the things that's very interesting here is that if you look at the chakra system with Western eyes, you begin to see that it connects into the endocrine system. At least I saw that very early on, when I was thinking, well, isn't this interesting that, we have this red color connected to the adrenals. We have the orange, the sense of playfulness, connected to creativity and the reproductive system. So to me, this felt like a very comprehensive operating system upon which I was already seeing many patterns, many manifestations in people's lives. And so what I decided to do was to build upon this with systems, looking at food, looking at lifestyle, looking at psychological themes. And I'll show you what that looks like. So this is the 7 systems of health chart that everything that I teach really goes to this chart. And in fact, all of you can get this off the foodandspirit.com website. You can just download this for your own, just to have and to use as you'd like. So what I'm going to do is to walk you through this a bit. I'm going to tour you through each of the colors and talk a little bit more about the endocrine association, the anatomical association. What does the anatomy do physiologically, and what are the core issues, as well as food and lifestyle. So this is what I teach within the certification program. It's what I teach within my books, whether it's the Whole Detox book, the Rainbow Diet book that I've written. And what I have done in the certification program is created a toolkit so that practitioners can assess where their clients or patients have imbalances, and from there, personalize to a particular therapeutic protocol to address those imbalances with food and or lifestyle. So it's, as you can see, there are many moving parts here. It can be pretty complex. It's a very big tapestry of many pieces. And so it requires some finesse in putting it together, clinically, that is. And I do get into the sophistication of how these different systems work together. So of the 7 systems, how do they interrelate? And that's something that I teach a bit more within the course. I also go through different, what I call the food and spirit matrices, which for each of the 7 colors, you can see how the energetic aspects, the qualities of a particular aspect of life can translate into something that's more physical, or even something that's more emotional, and how you have these mini spectrums within the larger spectrum. And so it provides a language. This is where physical medicine folks can really meet and connect with mental, emotional concepts and even practices in their clients' lives. So the color-coded system that I've been referring to is, of course, called Food and Spirit. Every color is connected to a body part, as I mentioned, the physiological aspects of those body parts, the lifestyle, and then the food and nutrition. And I've written extensive books on all of those. And again, that's what is embraced here within the 7 systems chart. So what I want to review with you, or maybe for some of you, this is brand new, I'd like to go through 3 different areas. And I'm going to do it in a more, I would say, almost like a story. I'm going to move through these because many of them are going to be pictures and images. So I'm going to first take you through each of the colors, through the 7 systems of health. I'm then going to take you through the 7 barriers to those 7 systems. And then what are the 7 modalities for each of those 7 systems? And that's something I go through quite extensively in the whole detox book. So let's start. So this is red. And for each of the colors, I'll start out with the general imprint of the color, what it means. I have different names for each of the colors as well. So yes, this is red, but I'm also calling it the root. It's the earth element. It's the physical part of us. And if you look to the right of the slide here, up on top, you see the qualities, the life qualities, and down below you see the food aspects. And so the life qualities here, family, community, tribe, that sense of instinct, the ability to fully be in your body, be grounded, feel that blood rushing through you. The structure of the body, anything that we need for survival would be connected to this aspect, this system of the root. And then, of course, there are certain nutritional components that would support those systems. So, for example, I taught another course called Rainbow Foods and Supplements, in which I gave the scientific rationale for why is protein connected to stability? Why do we need minerals in order to fortify our structure? And how do minerals help us to feel in the body? And how do they compete with things like heavy metals? How do we get things like vitamin C from red colored foods in order to fortify our immune system? So it's quite vast in terms of all the different features and facets, of course. The color red, if you're interested in colors, I don't subscribe to any particular color therapy or color principles other than what I've observed and intuited throughout the years of observation, being in clinical practice. But in my whole detox book, I do go through every color and the science of that color, whether it's on our physiology or our psychology. I'm just fascinated with the healing nature of all these colors. So even as we go through, ask yourself, what are my favorite colors? What colors am I drawn to? What colors am I not so drawn to? Because that's also relevant. So red is, again, the color of the root. One of the other things that I've created by way of helping people to engage with food and eating is the Nourish Your Whole Self card deck. And this is a card from that deck in which people pull a card and they get an inspirational message about food and eating. And so the root is really all about that sense of reaction. You know, we might think of something angry, or we might think of something passionate. There are certain things in our environment that are deliberately colored as red in order to get our attention, like a stop sign. And that's rather a universal, based on my world travels, is whenever we have something to pay attention to, it seems as though it's in either the red, orange, or yellow, right? We think of red as the red blood cells in the body. So in the Rainbow Diet, I talk about what are the nutrients that are required to feed and nourish our red blood cells. How do we support red blood cell health? When I think of the different colors of food, you're going to see, I'm just going to quickly thumbnail this as we go through, that every color is connected to a specific function. So when I think of red foods, I think of foods that help us with inflammation, the actual red in the body. And and it's not that only red colored foods help with inflammation, but that I've really seen a preponderance of red colored foods that have been helpful for things like quelling inflammation and bringing those out. So when I think of red food-based phytonutrients, I think of helping to reduce inflammation, protecting cells from damage, assisting with the function of the immune system, as well as supporting the adrenal glands, fortifying the bones, and building the blood. And these are all of the systems, the physiological systems that coincide with the root. So, of course, we might think of tomatoes. I think of lycopene from tomatoes. Tomatoes have so many different pigments, actually. Even though we only see red, there are a number at play here. We wrote a blog on color density in which we looked at the many different pigments that are within tomatoes. Now, if you look at the studies on tomatoes, you see that there's a connection with helping to reduce inflammation. I also think of immune modulating foods, not poisonous mushrooms per se that are red, but whether it's mushrooms or other immune based agents. I'm even thinking of, goodness, so many things, whether it's different cell wall material, beta glucans, whether it's from mushrooms or from some other source. I think of root vegetables. So when I think of the root, I'm thinking of what grows in the earth. So whether it's beets or any other root vegetable that is filled with insoluble fiber and minerals to also support this system. All right, the flow is connected to orange. I remember when I was going through my painting spree when I wasn't feeling very well, orange was the color that I never wore, but it was the color I always painted with. So I think I needed some orange. I think I needed some flow. I call this the flow, and it connects to the creative aspects of us, physically creative as well as physiologically creative. And again, if we look at the far right of the slide, the terms up at the top reflect movement, flow, creativity, relationships, partnerships, emotions, sensuality. And if we look at the foods that support those systems, it would be anything that keeps us flowing, whether it's water, it's the water element. It's also fats and oils, tropical fruits like papaya or mango, things that are high in water content. Fish and seafood, nuts and seeds, fermented foods, any foods for the reproductive system, and the urinary tract, which oversees fluid in the body, of course. And so what you're going to find throughout Food and Spirit when I do training is that I'm not wedded to a particular dietary dogma. I do believe in many different personalized eating paths, and we've had a number of people in the training that have had many different types of classifications on their eating style, whether they were vegan or paleo or keto, or maybe they were flexitarian. They ate a number of different things, but we were all coming together to talk about the colors of these foods and their actual properties. What did they do in the body? What did they do? And even looking at these qualities of foods in a more metaphorical or symbolic sense. So why are certain people drawn to ketogenic diets? Why are we drawn to higher protein diets? Why are we drawn to perhaps having no restraint with how we're eating? You know, all of that within the food and spirit system is viewed in a very symbolic, systematic way. So I wanted you to know that I don't preach to a certain diet. What I'm more interested in is our relationship with food and eating, and diving into that from multiple different angles. So yeah, orange is all about the flow. It's childlike, it's swirly. You know, when I think of the root, I think of something that's square, grounded. It's very earthed, and with the flow, it's very unearthed. It's messy, it's chaotic. This is the part of us that many people don't actually feel comfortable with. They like order, they like structure, and having too much of this flow can be a little bit uncomfortable. And so bringing in that sense of creativity can be so healing. In fact, there are some wonderful scientific publications on the benefits of creative expression. And we don't have to be a trained painter. We don't have to be a trained musician or a trained actor. Sometimes just allowing ourselves to express in the ways that feel good for us are healing in and of self, for us, right? We don't have to have the training. We need to make that space. So with the orange color, it's juicy, it's vibrant, it's again, the reproductive system is what we're most concerned with here, as well as the water of the body, how we are flowing. And sometimes it requires that we have to get out of our own way. We've got to get out of our own ways of thinking and flow more fluidly with life. You know, sometimes we're kind of stagnant and stuck. And so opening up to that potential, opening up to the beauty, you know, the flow system is so much about really being one with our senses. And even in the eating relationship, I feel that so many of us have moved away from that sense of play, even eating with our fingers, our hands. You know, we're so worried about being messy and being controlled rather than having some fun and some play with our meals, which is why I'm really drawn to work with kids and helping them to really honor and connect to that sense of playfulness. So with orange colored foods, I do think about the science of carotenoids. Carotenoids are in plant tissue, and it's what makes them different colors. And what we know about the science, and you'll see that in my whole detox book or even the Rainbow Diet, I talk about how these colorful compounds go into certain parts of the body and help with the function of that particular body part. Now, for me personally, I was struggling with endometriosis. I had a lot of ovarian issues. I had a blocked fallopian tube. And what was interesting was that my master's thesis was on carotenoids. And here, one of the answers was right before me, is to ensure that I'm eating carotenoids, a full spectrum of carotenoids. As you can see here from this publication, 14 different carotenoids have been identified in the ovarian tissue. In fact, this is one of my paintings in which, as my husband would like to say, I was painting my own ovaries and uterus, perhaps as a way of healing. So looking at nuts and seeds, orange foods that have high concentrations of fats and oils that can be very fluid and flowing and rich in these carotenoids to be protective. And it's not just protective for women, but for men too. So if you look at some of the studies on sperm quality and carotenoid concentration, there is that connection too. This was an interesting, relatively recent study from September 2016, looking at how having fruit. And what was really interesting in this study is that the fruit was orange in color. So mandarins, oranges, and peaches having a certain amount of a carotenoid called beta-cryptozanthin was helpful in delaying ovarian decline. In other words, prolonging menopause a bit. So there's something to be said for these healing orange foods. Here's another one that just came out in February 2018. Women consuming greater than or equal to 1 serving of citrus fruits per day had a 22% lower endometriosis risk compared to consuming less than 1 serving per week. So it doesn't even take that much. Getting those colors within our daily eating is so essential. And that's often the place that I'm starting clinically with people. All right, let's move on a little bit quicker now to fire. And fire is quick. It is the fire element. It's the digestive tract. It is all about transformation, confidence, self-esteem, how we burn bright in the world. Or are we burning out? Okay, so this is, I have a questionnaire which is on my whole-detox.com site. You can just get it for free. It's a questionnaire that's available. You can do the questionnaire. It will give you a printout of how you stand and how each of these systems measure up for you. 80% of people tend to have a fire imbalance. So when we look at the food side, you might think that it makes sense, right? Because of carbohydrates, too much sugar. It's almost like we're trying to get our fire back. We're trying to get back that energy. And what gives us the energy faster than anything? It's carbohydrates, simple sugars. And so we look at here, yellow is an interesting color because many of us like the color yellow. I bet if I were to be in a room with all of you and I asked how many of you would like to be in a yellow room, most of us would raise our hands. And in fact, there was a study in Manchester, England that showed that people that like the color yellow tended to be healthier and happier than people who did not like the color yellow. They actually mapped people's mood states to their color preferences, and they found that yellow is a happy color. We think of what burns bright. The sun makes us happy. We look at smiley faces. We see the yellow smiley face. So there's something about the transformation that happens with yellow, that it's a catalyst for something. It creates that swell of energy within us. It's a spark of inspiration. It's perhaps that empowering sense of feeling powerful too, and being able to radiate that forth into everyday life rather than feeling really burnt out, right? So it can also be about achievement and goals. And, for some people, I think that can be healthy. And I think that for other people, what can happen is there's a little bit too much of that. I know for me personally, there was a little bit too much of that in the way of constantly driving, achieving, hitting goals, going from one program to the next, 1 degree to the next. And then eventually I realized that, my goodness, I'm feeling really worn. I'm feeling really like I need some juicy creativity in my life because everything just feels so it was wearing me out. And so there's a happy balance to each of these colors and each of these systems. Sometimes we need a little bit more. We may need a little bit of fire underneath us, but for others of us, we may feel a little bit too fried. Look at even our language around how we feel. So, is there a spectrum of color for each of the different kinds of foods? Yes, there is. If we look at yellow, we can have unhealthy yellow foods on one end of the spectrum. We can have healthy yellow foods on the other end of the spectrum, just like we can with orange or with red or with green. And so when I think of yellow foods, I think of the acid-forming yellow foods. I'm thinking of digestion, the acid of the stomach, the bile, the yellow bile of liver. How do we stimulate and help those different organs to produce the spark that we need to digest properly? And if you look at what most health conditions are about, it is really about digestion. we're not taking in life and transforming it in such a way that we feel balanced. So again, I'm not showing you all of the science that really underpins my thinking on all of these because of this abbreviated webinar. But if you go through the certification or you've gone through one of my food and supplement courses, there is a whole robust list of references that really goes with each of these to support why do I see yellow being connected to digestion. In fact, there are a number of blogs that we've also written that are on the website too, deannaminich.com. So naringenin from citrus, creating metabolic efficiency. You know, there's so much about this idea of white adipose tissue moving into a more thermogenic browning of that adipose tissue, which is, that whole process is called beiging, kind of like a yellowing or even a browning of tissue that makes it warmer, that creates more heat. Citrus flavonoids, in fact, I just collected another paper on this about how citrus can help even with hepatic dysregulation. It just came through my alerts the other day. I think of, I think of bees as one of the archetypal animals of this place of us, a bee being very directed and also very connected into sweeteners, providing us with honey. And if you look at the literature on honey, even helping with things like metabolic syndrome, it's really fascinating what you see out there. Honey can be a medicinal food, this yellow sweet food. So there's lots of literature on that. Now, as I mentioned, there can be a spectrum, and sometimes we're getting a little bit too much of the other end of the spectrum rather than the healthy side. So we need to also look at our processed carbohydrate intake and maybe substitute for more sustainable, longer lasting endurance type of carbohydrates if our bodies can tolerate it. And so many people have an issue with things like whole grains and legumes. So again, starting with the basics of digestion, getting back into acid forming yellow. And in some cases, people say, well, those foods might be acid forming to start, but once they get into the body, they may actually create more of an alkalinization. And so I've also touched on those topics. Bananas are very interesting. I'm mentioning them here because of their prebiotic fiber. They're a bit of a mood food. They contain serotonin, and not to say that I've seen studies that show that if you eat more bananas that you feel better, but because we're talking about balanced work-life balance and feeling good and in the zone, having sustainable energy, looking at the balance of some of the different fruits that we take in, and also looking at vegetables like squashes. Okay, we're up to the green, which is the love, as I call it. So our focus here is the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system. How do we open our hearts? Well, we can do that with leafy green vegetables. We can help our circulation. We can help open our blood vessels with all of those dietary nitrates that we find in the green leafies, as well as get some vitamin K1. We can look at folates that are naturally occurring that can be helpful for our system of love, right? So this isn't, again, it's not just the food, it's also how we sit within the symbolic aspects of each of these systems. And the heart, this green center, is a beautiful, what I call a divining rod between the warming colors of the physical body and the cooling colors of the non-physical body. And they all kind of meet there in the middle with the heart. And so we see an expansion. You know, what do we want in the heart space? We want to open wide. We want to expand out, which is, if you look at the research on forest bathing, I don't know if you've seen that. In Japan, forest bathing is a really big deal. There are even scientific publications talking about vitamin N, being in nature, growing, healing through plants, and really having that experience of being in nature and how that affects our physiology and our psychology. I don't want to leave out the lungs here because they are, the way that I see the heart and the lungs, I see them as being more or less interdependent and, metaphorically speaking, I would say even married. One is so connected to the other. And so when we breathe in, so this is the air element. So the root being the earth, the flow being the water, the fire obviously being the fire, and now we get into the air. And when we bring in the air through breath, or even through foods that can help to protect oxidative stress in the body, we create more expansion. So green foods for that purpose, and there's no shortage of green foods. I go into laundry lists of many of these different colors of foods in the Rainbow Diet, in Whole Detox, in Chakra Foods, in a number of my books. And what makes each of these foods special in their function. And so I go into that as well. I mentioned the nitrates. These naturally occurring nitrates, once they come into our body and interact with our, whether it's our salivary microbiome, we start to produce more nitric oxide, which again helps us to relax, helps us to expand. And I think of the cruciferous vegetable family, very protective against whether it's chronic disease of all types. This was a study that I found recently looking at curly kale extract, helping with protection of even the skin. So, you know, there's so much here in terms of looking at the medicinal nature of plants, green foods. And again, I go through that much more extensively in the courses and in my books. The truth is how we speak. Now we're talking the thyroid gland. And as you can imagine, there aren't many aquamarine foods. There just aren't. And so we're looking here at not just aquamarine, we're looking at the concepts of voice and how we eat. Since we have the mouth in this area, it's really causing us to look up and out into the health of our thyroid, which is shaped like a butterfly gland, how we're taking things in, whether it's soups, sauces, broths, things that slow us down when we're eating. I'm just noticing in this picture these nice rainbow chopsticks there. So, you know, whether it's sea plants, and if I'm thinking of aquamarine or blue-green foods, I'm thinking of foods that are green that live in the sea that can help to nourish our thyroid gland because of their high level of certain minerals like iodine and selenium. Now, for certain people, those may not be good foods. They may have other issues with the truth system that for which reason they have to avoid those foods. So again, each of these, you can see it's a resilient system where each one has its own spectrum that has to be evaluated accordingly. So the sea plants, I also, in the supplement course, I talk about things like spirulina or chlorella, which again, from the sea and creating that sense of a full complement of many nutrients to support body systems. All right, moving on to the insight. Many people, whenever I ask audiences, they like this color blue-purple. They like, including my 4-year-old niece. And so when we talk about blue-purple, we're talking about the brain. And what did I base that on? Well, of course, ancient traditions. It started there. But then as I looked at the science, I started to realize that there's no accident that blue-purple is connected to the brain. If you look at the studies on blueberries and many of the proanthocyanins that are found in these blue-purple foods, they seem to be correlated with cognition and even mood. And so this is an area of focus for so many people is their cognition, how they feel, their mental sharpness. And so bringing together what I call the insight through this interface of blue-purple or an indigo. And even when I think of the neuronal landscape, I'm thinking of a dark sky with many stars, a constellation, very similar to the neuronal web. And so how do we keep our mood, our cognition burning bright with foods? Now, for this insight system, I often talk about how small things, intense things, can help to create better insight, better cognition, better mood. There are some nice articles looking at precursors of neurotransmitters and what do we need food-wise in order to feed our mood and feed our cognition, even beyond blueberries. So, but in general, I do, within the food and spirit training, we talk about blue purple foods being connected to cognition because of the science. And there's a short list of purple foods, right? There aren't so many of them. And so when they come our way, I often say, make sure that you choose purple whenever you can. And I've done a whole webinar before just on blue purple foods and cognition and mood. And so again, what I'm presenting here is really the tippy top of the science of what things like purple grape juice or blueberries, what they connect into health-wise. Here's another study, blueberries improving cognition in older adults. What's fascinating to me is that even in younger adults and in children, you can see those improvements in mood. This is one of those studies. This was published in 2017, looking at young adults, looking at children, and showing the effect of blueberry flavonoids on mood. And this was just in a short-term study. It shows the power of these certain foods and the impact that they can have on us. So blueberries, blackberries, these deeply pigmented blue-purple foods being so healing for our brain. And then I'll close the spectrum with the spirit, which even though I'm presenting it as lavender, I actually have it as white. And white because it's almost like a clean slate. It's purity, it's clarity, it is detoxification, it's a resetting. And white, if you look at white light through a prism, it's actually comprised of all of the colors. And so to me, having that connection with the non-physical parts of us, how do we come clean? You know, it's very interesting to me. I've written a book on detox called Whole Detox, as I've mentioned, and there's so much resistance to this word detox by certain people. And but what's interesting is that if you go back into ancient medical practices and ancient spiritual and religious traditions, there is this sense of fasting, abstaining from food, getting clear with one's body through the absence of food. So even though I go through each of the colors within the food and spirit certification and talk about how to connect clients and patients into that at a deeper level, I'm also talking about the absence of food as well. So white, the spirit cards align. Here's where I talk about more the nourishment aspects. I go deeper into nourishment because we don't have the nutrition aspects. So looking at studies, this one just came out in July 2018, showing how a sense of purpose moderates the associations between daily stressors and daily well-being. So if you have a sense of purpose, it's almost like you don't feel that same stress because you stay ratcheted up, high level, viewing your life from up above and basically looking at perhaps the deeper meaning of life and what has that significance for you. There is also the spectrum of white. If I hearken back to what my mom used to say when I was growing up, you know, we couldn't have white sugar, white flour, white salt, not in any appreciable quantities. And so I think of sugar and how it's pervasive and how so many people trying to move back and away from having all that sugar. And I think that when we move into that place of whether it's intermittent fasting or even having some hours of the day where we're not eating as much, having that sense of lightness, you know, having that sense of, I call it enlightened eating. This is the quality of light. You know, each of these colors and systems have an elemental property. And so here I connect into what is light, what is effervescent, what allows us to feel enlightened and purposeful. And you can't just take any dietary supplement for that. That requires a bit more in the way of looking at one's lifestyle. But here's where I also do talk about some healthful white colored foods, whether it's coconut, maybe for some, cauliflower, garlic, sesame seed. I talk about some of these as it relates to their detoxification properties. Now, in our remaining time, of which we have 10 minutes, and I wanted to reserve perhaps some time for questions if anybody has any to note, I quickly want to go through the 7 barriers, and this won't take very long at all. So in the whole detox book, what I do is I go deep into those 7 systems because I want you to have an understanding of those, because that's what navigates the operating, that is the operating system. And through that, we can understand where somebody is imbalanced, whether they're overactive or underactive. So what are the things that come up in life that we may be responding to in terms of overactivity or underactivity? These are what I call the 7 barriers. So I think of food, which is in alignment much more with the root system, that which is physical. Then I think of the flow system. What's the biggest barrier there? Well, emotional stagnation, right? Just think of so much work that can be done within that sphere. When we get into transformation, into the fire system, here is where we're digesting and we're transforming. And so bringing in the element of thought. And in some ancient traditions, we're digesting thoughts, just like we're digesting a meal. And so then I think about all of the thoughts that we may be having that aren't necessarily conducive to our lives and may lead us to different outcomes that we don't want to have. Not moving. This is, I would say, mine. I always have to remind myself, Deanna, you need to get moving. You know, this is the love system. This is, we need to keep things circulating, blood and oxygen. So not moving can be in the physical sense, but it can also be in the emotional, passionate sense of the heart. What do we feel heartfelt emotions for? Are we moving that through? Very important. Another barrier, not speaking the truth. It can also be keeping quiet when we need to be speaking up. So even within the whole detox program, I talk about exaggerating, swearing, lying, cheating, blackmailing, all of these things that we may express through words. And when it comes to eating, focusing on what are our eating truths. You know, that can be a very difficult question for some people to answer, and to answer it honestly. Another barrier, this is more for the insight. This is the brain, cognition, the land of dreams, going within, taking the eyes that are also part of the system and then closing them and looking on the inside. So poor sleep. You know, sleep is 21st century medicine. And we're seeing the connection between sleep and memory, sleep and eating behaviors, sleep and cravings. It's all out there. And then finally, what connects to the spirit system as a barrier is truly that lack of purpose. You know, this is when people feel very fragmented, dissociated. They don't feel the joie de vivre. They don't want to wake up in life and every morning kind of have something that they go to that they feel connected to. So that is the 7th barrier. And then what I have done is I've created specific modalities that align to the system, align to the barrier, and then provide a solution. So that in essence is the whole detox program, which is a 21-day program that is complete with 7 different modalities. And for some people, they can look at this menu and say, oh my goodness, that's a lot. I've got to do all of that. You don't have to do all of that. Some people have done it, but I make these each very brief, short, to the point, because I don't believe that lifestyle change has to be laborious. You actually want it to be ritualized and routinized into your everyday life in a seamless way. And the more that one is able to do that, I feel like the more that we see that ripple effect of change. That said, people can choose as many as they want of these. I like to see it in a circle rather than a line, because each of them get to the heart of healing. Remember that spectrum of health graphic where all the doorways lead in? Well, each of these is one of those doorways that leads in. So when I think of the red root, focusing on nutrition, what do we take out? What do we put in? When I focus on orange, most people, if you ask them how they feel, they don't have a real sense of their sense of emotion. You know, just Most people, when I say, how are you? They'll say, I'm concentrating, I'm focused. Uh, they'll give me thinking words rather than feeling words. And so for this purpose, I have an emotion log. And then, of course, thought work, which I give people specific thought-based activities to track and journal on. I think that that's so important. Reading our thoughts like we read our labels of foods. Having movement, and within the whole detox program, I have lots of different movement for different bodies, and so that you can shake things up and not get bored. Aquamarine, these are words and how we speak those words, positive words. And so I have an affirmation, and either people can create their own affirmation, but the power of words is great. Sleep, focusing on visualization. And so I have a number of those practices. I've written a whole book called the Complete Handbook of Quantum Healing with 100 of those visualizations for all different kinds of clinical conditions. And then finally, the spirit, in which I help clients to work with whatever gives them a sense of stillness and silence. So meditation, prayer, reflection, quick moments of that. And then what I do within the Food and Spirit certification is to show you how to put them all together. And so it seems like a lot because I just went through 7 systems, 7 barriers, 7 modalities. And then you're thinking, Deanna, how am I going to interlace all of those together? I do think that with the toolkit, you find it, I take you step by step. I'm a very system thinker. I like to do things in a very systematic way. And so I have it laid out in terms of the methodology. So each of the different systems, what are the assessments, what are the techniques? I have, and I'm just going to show you briefly some of the different tools in this toolkit of looking at somebody's story through the lens of each of these colors and systems. The spectrum quiz, which if you go through the certification, you have a very in-depth questionnaire that is not reflected on the website. The one on the website is a very basic binary system, but what you have access to as a practitioner who goes through the program is one that helps you to see if somebody is overactive or underactive. And from that, you can plot on the spectrum tracker where people are, and it becomes obvious where they need to work. You are also given some other tools like the daily life log to look at the different foods, types of foods. And I like to look at food and eating a little bit differently, more in a color-coded way rather than an analytical calorie gram kind of a way that I think people have done for far too long and don't get results from. The emotion log is also provided in that way. And then what I consider the assessment form. How do you string it all together? And I help you to do that so that you know how to score and where do you go from there. I have a almost a 100-page personalized protocol guide that can help with deciding upon modalities for these different imbalances. So then you can put that together into a plan, and I discuss how to do that. And what's nice about this certification coming up is that you're going to have my mentorship going through that practicum with your own clients. So I am there with you in the background while you move through the whole process. And one of the things that I'm really big into is publishing. So collecting the data, maybe having a case study publication to show how robust it is to have this very integrated system rather than just one particular modality on its own, but having the flexibility to pick and choose as per the individual. So that brings us to a close. I'm ending here right on time. Again, one simple change is full of great, big, huge potential. And I really do think where we started this whole webinar is how do you heal the whole self? And I think that in so doing, really looking at the whole self and having proper systems and metrics and assessments in order to get into that really deep space, and then using creative modalities to help people to really transform in a great way. So I want to thank everybody for being live here with me. Again, if you're interested in the Certified Food and Spirit Practitioner Program, we are taking applications, And if you have any questions and you have some more personal questions about whether or not this would be a good fit for you, feel free to email us. And you can do that through the website, foodandspirit.com. And again, I don't think we have time for questions. I do want to honor your time. But if you do have specific questions, feel free to email us. And Heather and I will be standing by and hope to answer your questions. Thanks, everybody, for being with us. Bye-bye.